Hi everyone.
Hello.
I'm Jen Savage.
And I'm Dan Crowley.
I'm a software developer at Tabbed Out. We make a mobile app that lets you pay your bar tabs on your phone.
And I work in the Application Security Services Department of TrustWave's Spider Labs. And today we're going to be talking about what we are referring to as a concept called the Patsy Proxy. So basically, this term comes from the slang term patsy, which means somebody who is easily taken advantage of, somebody gullible, somebody who's going to take the fall for something. It's like gangster slang. Somebody referred to as a patsy is like a scapegoat, and then a proxy, that's something you probably understand the concept of. So you put this together, and it's basically something that acts as a proxy without knowing that it's acting as a proxy. So the advantages of Patsy Proxy, as opposed to a traditional proxy, is that the proxy owner is unaware of the proxy. And you'll understand more about this as we continue to talk about this. The other thing is that since this is an unintentional proxy, the target is also unaware that the victim of this unintentional proxying acts as a proxy. So it looks to the target of the actual attack like this unintentional proxy is the attacker. So it's not going to be publicly listed as a proxy. So sometimes you'll have like public proxy lists which tell you, here's a guy in Russia, here's a guy in the United Kingdom, here's a guy in Micronesia. All of these are serving up open proxies. If you have a system that will act as a proxy unintentionally, that's not going to be on any public lists. And there's not going to be any traditional proxy service on the victim, most likely. It's not necessary that there will be. Logging will be unlikely, because if you're not aware that you're acting as a proxy, you're probably not going to log the stuff that's going through you as a proxy.
But don't count on it.
The other thing is the IP might be privileged. You might get something which has special privileges either with an internal network or because of what the system actually is.
Why did we keep this one? Okay, so the disadvantages include that obviously because you're working on a system that is not intended to be a proxy, you may have limited access to what you can do. So the attack may be a blind attack. You can say, send this traffic through and then not get the result back, right? The proxy may actually modify the traffic as it's going through. We've seen this. There may be a time delay. We've seen that on Google's servers, and then it may passively certain types of traffic. That's obvious, and then also you just don't know what's happening to your traffic. It may be being logged.
Right. The thing is, when you're working with a traditional proxy, it's fairly reliable. You kind of know what you're getting because it's a traditional proxy service, and it's expected to act in a certain way. But because we're hackers and because we're working with things that aren't intending to work in the way that we're making them work, it's not guaranteed that they're going to work in a way that we expect them to. Now, we're talking mostly about web-centric stuff. We're talking mostly about web-based Patsy proxies, if you would. Many of these only allow get parameters. So mostly you're talking about giving some, let's say, web application a URL, which it will then go and fetch for you. And sometimes gets are interpreted as commands. Now, a lot of time you'll see web applications that will only accept commands in the form of post. Now, the thing is, most application frameworks will actually accept post parameters as get parameters. So if you're looking for a specific variable name in the post, but it's actually in the get, most application frameworks will say, that's close enough. That's good enough for me.
So you can just look at the page, figure out the names of the post parameters, and then construct a query string and send it through as a get parameter in the URL. So you can do any attack in URL. Apache's max URI is 8,000 characters. So you actually have a lot of space to do your attacks in.
Now, a lot of applications will actually go and fetch things just to make sure that they're there. And for that, they will usually, a lot of times we'll use a head request, because a head request doesn't actually pull down any data, so you're reducing the amount of bandwidth you use. Now, what's something interesting is that head requests are actually processed by applications identically to GET requests, except that they don't return any data. So if, as long as you don't care about getting anything back, it doesn't really matter that you're only using a head request. Like I said, no data will be returned, and if you're looking for some sort of DOS capability, which we will discuss later, and I promise you it's fucking cool, it's not really going to work with head requests so well. There might also be the problem that the Patsy proxy is blind, where you're not going to get any data back. That's going to be the case in a head request. It might also be the case that something fetches a URL for you, but uses it only internally, or interprets the data and then gives you something based on what it's interpreted, or gives you only part of the data or something like that. But that doesn't matter so much because many attacks can be launched with minimal data or no data.
Malicious uses. Obviously, you can frame someone because you can do an attack from their IP. You could post threats, harass people, access legal markets, or launch any attacks you want. Potentially, you can anonymize an attack, but you can't count on it because you don't know if the Patsy is logging. You can do any traditional attack you could do through a URL. So if there's SQL injection through the URL, if you can pass it through the query string, then you can do your SQL injection, remote file inclusion, denial of service. You might have to do a little bit of recon on your target, but then you can have whatever Patsy proxy you want do the actual attack for you. Really good if you're using prepackaged software that you know is vulnerable.
One of the traditional uses for a proxy is to bypass IP address filtering, either as far as a blacklist, where you, let's say you're on a forum and you get blocked, you can't post on the forum anymore. So you use some proxy to post on this forum because it's done by IP, and now you're using a different IP. So a lot of sites, in order to avoid this sort of blacklist, proxy-based blacklist avoidance, will look at lists of public proxies and use these like Tor exit nodes, lists of open proxies, and disallow any of them from taking certain actions. And since you're using something that's not a traditional open proxy, and it's not a Tor exit node or anything that's going to be publicly known as a proxy, you'll probably get through this blacklist. You might also be able to exploit IP trust relationships, where you have the ability to pass traffic from one system to any system you choose, and that system that you're proxying through actually has some trust set up with some other system. So only that system or a set of systems within that network can pass messages to this one system and have them accepted. So it's something like the confused deputy problem at that point. The other thing that I wanted to mention is sometimes with traditional proxies, frequently you have something where it'll disallow any sort of internal IP address ranges. So anything 192.168, whatever, 172.168, whatever, 127, whatever, will be disallowed by the proxy. Not so much with these unintentional proxies.
Right, so if you've ever worked with Postgre, you can, for instance, trust IPs, or a lot of systems you can say, any traffic that comes through these people don't have to log in, just give them full access or something like that. So anyway, methods to achieve Patsy proxy. So automated services. So URL shorteners and unshorteners will often do a full HTTP GET against the URL that you submit at the time of shortening it. So if it's already been shortened once before, it won't work, but if it's new to the URL shortener. And you can make it new to the URL shortener by adding any old parameter at the end. So question mark, blah, 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 variable name equals something that doesn't actually exist, and it gets ignored. So web spiders, so you can submit a URL to Google or Yahoo or something and say, spider this, and quite often they'll wait. Google waits 24 hours to spider it, right? But it still spiders it, and it does a full HTTP GET against all the page that it spiders. So you can give it, and any links. So you can give it, a URL that contains your attack string if you want. Twitter bots. So we did some basic social engineering tests, and what we discovered is that anything that gets posted to Twitter is within milliseconds automatically, something follows the URL. So Twitter bots will grab copies of the contents of the URLs for you. So you can just post anything to Twitter and just assume that it'll get attacked. Upload from URL functionalities. So like vbolden, you can say, this is my avatar, it's located on this other website over here, and so you can supply like myurl.com / mybadscript.whatever, question mark, blah, 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 .jpg, it assumes it's a JPG, and then, you know, it goes and it does a full HTTP GET against it, and it's not a JPG, so it gets an error, but it still does that HTTP GET and then performs whatever attack you include in that query string.
Just to clarify with vBulletin, as long as the URL ends in .jpg, even if it's a fake parameter appended to the end, it will still fetch that URL.
So web page translation utilities like Google Translate, you can supply a URL and it will translate that URL for you. It has to do a GET to do that, right? So this is really basic functionality. The whole web is like founded on this functionality. You can't just like get rid of it or anything. Anyway, and link preview functionality also does this. So here you can see with Google Translate, we're just pasting in like, oh, here's our forum backup. Please translate it from English to English. Or Thai to English. And if it's in English already on that page, it'll just leave it in English. Okay. Facebook, when you go to include any URL on a Facebook status update, it will actually do a GET against the contents of the page. And it doesn't populate the X forwarded by header. So it keeps it anonymous so that people won't know what profile was like posting about a link or anything. So it actually anonymizes it too. And then, so automated services, some malware scanning utilities like mail gateway scanners. This fellow, Jay Curran, who lives in Austin with us, has a project called Project Tuna, which you can get to yourself if you want the contents of Project Tuna, tuna.pentestify.com/emails, and basically he sends a bunch of really junk email out to a bunch of gateways out there, and oftentimes gets full responses, including what software is being run. Like amazing information. And from that data, we were able to figure out a list of servers that we could test against. So we sent out a bunch of emails, including URLs, to these servers to see if any of them would actually follow the URL. And what we found is that a lot of them have switched to using Google's safe browsing database. So they check the URL against Google's safe browsing database, and if it's not in the blacklist, then they don't bother checking it at all, and they send it through. So good job on, creating that safe browsing database that prevents this attack. But ClamAV does include this in their documentation.
So ClamAV no longer does this by default. They used to in old versions, but there still is the option. If you want, you can include libcurl in the ClamAV daemon when you compile it, such that any URLs that come through email messages that are being checked for malware will be followed. So you can get ClamAV to follow any URL that you want, including attack URLs. Just by sending an email to something with ClamAV daemon enabled. And if you've never seen the GeoCitysizer, it's awesome. But you basically give the GeoCitysizer a URL of something to turn into a web page that looks like it was made in 1996 by a 13-year-old. And it's really funny. But you can give it any URL and it'll go and fetch this and return you, albeit littered with animated GIFs and whatnot, a copy of the web page. So you can hack things through the GeoCitysizer and get a bunch of animated GIFs. So we set up a...
So this was back to the emails that I was sending out to all the mail gateway scanners that we found through Project Tuna. One of them responded with this really interesting thing. So we had this patsy.php that was just logging all of the GET requests against it, right? And what we found is that it was taking the parameter, which we at the time were sending as the name of the server. So site equals, and then we had server name, and it was putting it through Rot 13. So we're like, okay, does it do this all the time? And so here it is again with another email sent from the same email address, the second email, where it did a full HTTP GET against the same site with a different parameter, and EBG13. So it took it and it put it through Route 13. So hey, if you've got an attack, just put it through Route 13 and then send it to this email gateway. Right.
So a lot of traditional vulnerabilities you find in web applications can also be used for this purpose. If you have something like cross-site scripting or HTML injection, you can actually, as long as you're getting somebody to click on it, which, let's admit it, is not hard, you can get somebody to visit something for you. Now, if you were to send an email to somebody and say, hey, there's free kittens, pictures of kittens at this URL, please click. And that URL is like victim.com/x.php x equals single quote semicolon drop table products semicolon double dash. Then some poor sap is going to drop a database for it's going to drop a table for you. XML injection. A lot of XML parsers will parse foreign entities. Will based on the document description, will go out and fetch external resources. This includes URLs, HTTP URLs, FTP URLs, and a various other number of URI types dependent on the XML parser that you're talking about. And this can be used to do this exact same sort of thing. SQL injection, there are a lot of databases out there that will support making queries to HTTP resources or HTTPS, FTP resources, things like that. So if you have an SQL injection flaw, you can then use that database system to reach out to other systems and launch attacks. The same can be said for remote file inclusion. That one barely needs saying, but it's worth mentioning anyway.
Right, so we did a bunch of social engineering attacks, and they're not worth talking about because we don't have a lot of time. But basically, our results were that pretty much everybody falls for them. So people are great Patsy proxies. So we talked about a bunch of ways that you can achieve Patsy proxies, things that are out there. They're not really their own vulnerability. They're a way of delivering an attack, right? So the next question is, but could it be a vulnerability? Is it possible that if you're running a Patsy proxy on your server, you are, making your system vulnerable in some way? So after some testing, we found that you could do a recursive denial of service attack against a Patsy proxy by pointing the Patsy proxy back at itself. So basically, if you have like myurl.com, slash whatever.php, which is the Patsy proxy itself, question mark, parameter equals, and then the variable has to include a URL, and that would be what it would go and do the get against. Then you just pass that URL, everything up until the equal point, as the variable contents, right? And over and over and over again, up until the next URI, which by default, and nobody seems to change this, by default in Apache, is 8,000 characters, so that's quite a lot of space to actually do this in. And then at the end, because quite often these PHP files are rather small, so it's not really that much traffic to just send it through itself over and over again. At the end, you just tack on any large resource, and it doesn't even have to be on the site itself. And so every time it does that get, it passes that large resource back through and back through and back through and back through over and over again. And so, anyway, on our actual local LAN, we managed to take down my machine. I was just running it on a MacBook Air with 20 requests, and it took it down for 30 minutes. I was able to do a local host denial of service with 200 requests of the same nature. So,
and this is interesting because this indicates that this is not a bandwidth-based this is not a bandwidth-based denial of service attack. We're talking about resource exhaustion at the memory level. We're talking about it at the thread pool level. And this is interesting because every request has to wait for the next one to return something. So if you have let's say 100 different requests to the same Patsy being recursively called, you have 100 threads waiting, and then they all have to squeeze this large resource that you're tacking onto the end through every single iteration. So
by large resource, I mean 4 megabyte file that's an image of my daughter. But you could put a 4 gigabyte file or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it wouldn't even necessarily need to be that large. I mean, considering that 20 requests was enough to take something down, or 200 requests for that matter, that's practically nothing in the grand scheme of things. That's something that is very easy to achieve for attacker. So the amplification effect is enormous. And here's a quick example of just sort of what the test URL looked like, just a portion of that. Another thing that we looked at was WAF bypass. Now, since we can get the server to talk to something directly, if we have it talk to itself, then if we have something in the way, like let's say a WAF or some other preventive technology, like an IDS, we're bypassing that. So a malicious user can make a request through the WAF, let's say double encoded or triple encoded or whatever have you, and have the web server recurse until all of that encoding is gone and the attack is just there. So the web server talks to itself and does repeated decoding such that, you know, however many times the WAF decodes, will just do one more level of recursion and speak to the web server from itself and bypass the WAF. Now, this doesn't work when you have something like a WAF loaded as a web server module, but if you have something running as a reverse proxy or an inline proxy, this will work. So you have the web server talk to itself and deliver the attack to itself behind the WAF, such that the WAF never sees the unencoded attack.
It's kind of a specific attack because you have to have a Patsy proxy that is dealing with encoded data and decoding it, and you also have to have a WAF. But
so as far as the encoding goes, the web server will do the decoding for you, and every time you continue to make every time you recurse, it will do the decoding again because the web server does that by itself. Now, one really, really interesting thing that we looked at, think about it like this. When you're talking to a system and you're telling it, go and make this request, it's not using your bandwidth, it's using its bandwidth. So if you talk to a system and say, go fetch this large resource from, if you're system A and you're talking to system B and you say, go fetch a large resource from system C, it's using its bandwidth to fetch it. Now, if you're talking to systems, if you're system A and you're talking to systems B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, and you're telling them, all of you, go fetch a resource from, well, a really large resource from system X, this is a bandwidth amplification. You're using the bandwidth of all these different patsies that you're talking about. So let's say that you have 2 megs up, which is pretty decent. That's pretty nice. But let's say you have 30 patsies, each with 15 megs up. And you have access to some sort of scripting resource, which is like, okay, well, everybody does. So you tell each of these patsies, go and fetch this large resource repeatedly. You essentially have a botnet without having to compromise fucking anything. So it's like Instabotnet. It's really fantastic or terrible depending on who you are.
the great part about it is that anybody that's running a Patsy proxy needs that functionality, and you can just say, well, if you get attacked by me, it wasn't necessarily me, right? So anyway, so attacks to internal networks. Is this my slide? This is your slide.
Fine, it's my slide. So, as I mentioned before, modern proxies have a whole bunch of protections in place because they're aware of all sorts of abuses of proxy systems that have occurred throughout the years that people have figured out. But if you're running an unintentional proxy, that's probably not going to be something that you've accounted for. So modern proxies will enforce boundaries between internal and external resources. A lot of attackers really love to find open proxies available on the perimeter of a network that's exposed to the internet, because then they can go and traverse the boundary from the internet into the internal network just by requesting an internal resource through that proxy. Now, most proxies are configured not to do that because people have caught wise to that. But if you don't know that you're running a proxy, probably I can request internal resources and start doing nasty things. So unintentional proxies will probably allow boundary violation, kind of like you see in this theoretical example here. So we might be able to launch internal attacks. We can certainly do things like port scanning inside and then find applications and do all sorts of nasty things. If we know that a particular resource is running inside with a particular vulnerability, we might be able to attack that internally even though we don't have any direct access to it.
How many admins think that because they're behind a firewall, it's okay to run that in secure software, right? Anyway, so
Who have access to our internal network?
I don't know.
Nobody.
So attribution is harder. So there's already this ruling out there that says that an IP address is not a person. This is sort of backing that up. I think the ruling was based on a child porn case, but this is, this applies to the hacker world too. If you get attacked by an IP address, it's not necessarily the person who owns or is paid for that IP that did the attacking. IP address filtering is extremely ineffective, and I think also developers should be thinking a little harder before they just pass traffic through for a user. I don't know, if not just to protect themselves from possible court battles that might be costly. And then user education is valuable for users too. So this is going back to the idea that we did some social engineering testing and people are extremely good patsies. You can go on IRC to any old hacker channel and be like, hey kid, do you want to learn how to use, I don't know, some random tool, skinny tool that's out there? Go attack this IP for me. Tell me what the results are. Yeah, don't take candy from strangers.
Even more than that, the idea that I can send somebody a link and say, hey, go look at this, and then it posts a death threat towards the president on some public forum, they're gonna get their door kicked in.
Or just have some guy do recon for you. Have his IP do the recon and then do your attacks through Tor.
So this is something that's valuable if you're doing user awareness education, because if you tell somebody, don't click links because it could compromise our company, some people will be like, don't care. But if you tell them, if you click a link, you might get SWAT to kick in your door, they'll be like, whoa.
The FBI, son. The FBI.
So, don't take candy from internet strangers. We should all know this by now. Users should know this by now. But this is something that you might want to relay to users as a part of user awareness education, that it might have effects for you too, personally. And so that reaches the end of our presentation. So if you, we have 3 minutes, so if anybody has questions, we'd be very happy to answer them.
Come see us afterwards.
Sure, yeah, come find us. We're very, I'm personally.
I'm going to go have more of that barrel cask beer if anyone wants to join me.
I'm enormously ugly, so I should be very recognizable. So if you, yeah, I'm also wearing a Goatsy shirt. So if look for the guy in the Goatsy shirt. If you want to ask us questions, we will be around the con. It's much better than that.
Can it be both?
It can be both. Thank you very much.